In this demo, I want to go ahead and take a look at how we create a full HTML page. And then I also want to start taking advantage of some of the features that come along with using a text editor like Atom, and how it's going to help us with CSS and how it's going to help us with HTML and JavaScript. So how Atom is actually going to help us. Okay, so we want to create an HTML page. So I'm going to go ahead and start with our tag structure. So I want to start with an HTML tag and a closing HTML tag, beginning and ending head section, a beginning and ending body section. I want to also now introduce the concept of adding a comment for our page. So this page was created by Brian Witkowski as a sample website. Okay, so just the concept of having a comment there, indicating who created it, maybe a timestamp of when it was created and what day it was created on, so people can see right away, like, hey, this was created 10 years ago, or this was created 10 days ago. Because that's going to have an impact on how the HTML looks. Okay, so we have our basic HTML structure, and then I'm going to go ahead and save the page. So I'm going to save it on my desktop, and then I'm going to use that structure on my desktop of having web pages separate from our style sheets, separate from our images. So I'm going to go ahead and save this, and I'm going to put it on the desktop in a new folder called sample website. So this is the container folder. And then inside the sample website, I'm going to have a new folder called web pages. And that's where this file is going to go. And then once I have that structure set up, so right now I'm in the web pages folder. I don't necessarily like the look of this where I'm just navigating web pages. And what I mean by that is if I skip over to the Finder window, which is kind of like Windows Explorer, I really want to be looking at my whole website. So right now I have web pages. I'm going to have a new folder called images, and I'm going to have another new folder called style sheets. Okay, and sample website is my project, and inside my project I have these three subfolders, and right now we have one file in the web pages subfolder called index.html. That's not what I'm seeing here. So notice I'm only seeing the web pages. I don't see the style sheets. I don't see the images. And so what I want to do is I want to remove this project folder. And then I want to add the project folder that's sitting on my desktop. Okay, by adding that project folder that's sitting on my desktop, I can see the whole directory structure that I created. I can see the sample website. I can see the images folder, the style sheets folder, the web pages folder. Okay, and we're working with our one web page that we have. Okay, so I'm going to show you a nice feature of Atom. So I'm going to go ahead and just resize this window a little bit. One of the nice features of Atom is this idea of code completion. And you'll see that Atom now knows that this is an HTML file. And the reason Atom knows that this is an HTML file is because I saved it with the .html file extension. Because Atom knows it's an HTML file, now I'm going to get some nice features like code completion. Okay, so for example, if I come into the body and I create an H1 tag, I can just type H1, and what shows up here is what's known as IntelliSense. So if I hit enter, it'll put the beginning and ending tag pair there for me. And it'll do that for almost all of our tags. So H1 tags, paragraph tags, div tags, span tags, form tags. So any kind of HTML tag that I want to create, I'm going to have IntelliSense because Atom knows that this is an HTML file. Okay. One of the coolest things Atom does, and you kind of have to watch close here, is if I type in HTML, there's a template for an HTML file. So I type in HTML and you'll notice I get this IntelliSense showing me, hey, this is a shortcut for that HTML template. And if I hit enter here, it fills in the basic shell of an HTML page for me. It adds a few additional things that we haven't talked about in this class, but you'll notice it has the beginning and ending HTML tag, it has the beginning and ending head section, it has the beginning and ending body section, and it goes a little bit further in that it defines what language we're talking about, what direction we're going to be writing, so we're writing left to right, what character set, so we're using UTF-8 encoding. It puts a page title in, so if we want to say, here's our page title, here is my first sample site. Okay, so I have a page title that's going to show up in the tab in my browser window, and I got all of that from code completion. So that's a really nice feature that's built into Atom, and it comes with Atom as soon as Atom recognizes the file that you're working with as an HTML file. There's two ways to do that, so I'll show you in a new file. So with this new file, by default, Atom thinks we're dealing with plain text. If I save this file with a .html file extension, Atom would know that it's an HTML file. The other way that that could be accomplished is down here I can click on this plain text and I can tell Atom that this is an HTML file. Once I've done that, now I'm going to have IntelliSense for HTML and I get that code completion again, even though I haven't saved this file yet. If I'm working with a style sheet, and you'll notice style sheet didn't show up, if I type in CSS, there's CSS. Now it recognizes, for instance, let's say I wanted to highlight something. So now when I highlight something, I want to change the background color. You'll notice that I get that code completion. Okay, so depending on what Atom thinks you're working with based on this selection down here, or based on how you save the file with your file extension, Atom will give you that code completion depending on what type of file you're working with. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and close this file since we're just working with our HTML file. Okay, so then if I'm looking at this HTML page, I should be able to render it. And again, we've talked about a couple of different ways where we can see those files. One way we can see those files is we can just go out to the file system and double click on the file and it'll show up in the browser. The other option that we had is we installed this Atom live server package. So I'm going to go ahead and start that live server package and I'm going to browse into my page. So this is my index.html page. Okay, so and you'll notice here's my page title. Here's my first sample site. That matches the page title that I used here in the head section. Okay, so what we really want to discuss today is how do we create a basic web page, and I think we're getting there, right? So we have beginning and ending HTML tags, we have beginning and ending head sections, we have a beginning and ending body section, but now we want to take it a step further in what actually goes in the HTML body. And there's all sorts of tags that we're going to deal with throughout this class, but really those tags are going to get lumped into two different categories. So those tags are going to get lumped into either being inline elements or block elements. And the goal of today's discussion is to really be able to identify, are we talking about an inline element or a block element? And that is kind of a easy distinction to talk about, but then in reality, when you're trying to distinguish between the two, it kind of muddies the waters a little bit. Okay, so I want to show you kind of the classic examples of what's a block element versus an inline element. Okay, so if I have a div tag being the classic block element, and then I repeat this, okay, so I have 4 of them, so those are my classic block elements, versus my classic inline elements. My classic inline elements being a span tag. Okay, so I have this classic inline element, it's a span tag, beginning and ending span tag, and I'm just going to have 4 of those as well. And I just copied and pasted there. And I want you to, like when we render this out, so when we look at the browser, I want to look at the distinction between the block elements versus the inline elements. Okay, and you'll notice what ends up happening is this block element is on a new line each time. So I have 4 classic block elements, whereas the classic inline element doesn't have that same space requirements. And here's what's going on, is a block element will take all of the available space of the item that it's contained within. So in this case, the block element, the container of the block element, if we go back to our code, is the HTML body. So the body is the container of this div. It's the container of this div, container of this div, container of this div. So these divs are going to take all of the available space within the body. So let's get back to the browser. It's going to take all the available space. So this div, even though it's left aligned, actually spans from the left edge of my browser window all the way over to the right edge of my browser window. So it takes up all that space. Then the next div goes from the left edge to the right edge. The next div, left edge to the right edge. Next div, left edge to the right edge. Versus these inline elements, what goes on with the inline elements is an inline element will take only the space that it needs. So it's not going to fill all the available space. It's only going to take the space that it would need. Okay, and where we can see this is I want to do a little bit of styling. Okay, so in the head section, I'm going to go ahead and add a style. So here's a style tag. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that all div tags should have a border. Okay, so all of my div tags should have a border that's solid. Okay, and I skip back over to the browser window, and you'll notice that those div tags, it put that black border around it, and you'll notice that the div tag actually goes all the way from the left edge to the right edge of that window. And that's because it's taking up all of the space that it needs inside of that container. Okay, whereas if I do that with an inline element, so if I do the exact same thing with a span tag, or my span tag, so I put a border on all of my span tags as well, you'll notice that that border only encompasses the span tag, and the span tag's only taking the space that it needs to actually render out my text. It doesn't take any more, it doesn't take any less, it takes exactly what it needs without creating any kind of white space afterwards. It doesn't fill the whole area. That's the difference between a block element and a span, or I'm sorry, a block element and an inline element. Okay, so then we start to get into what are block elements versus inline elements. Okay, so if I want to test this, a block element being a paragraph tag, here is my first paragraph. And then I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste this. Here's my second paragraph. Here's my third paragraph. And we'll notice that it's a block element. And the way we know it's a block element is not by the fact that it's easy to recognize a block element when it takes up all of the space from left to right. Well, with our paragraph tags, it's hard to see that because we don't have a border around it. But what we do see is that each of the paragraphs end up on a new line. And that should be a pretty good clue as to the fact that a paragraph tag is a block element. Okay. So then we have paragraph tags, we have div tags, we might have labels to render text, we might have h1 tags to render text. So there's all sorts of different options here. So if I use an h1 tag, here is my heading. We can skip back over and you'll see that again, these text elements, my h1 tag, is causing my first paragraph to render on the next line. So that's an indication that my h1 tag is also a block element. And we can verify that, again, by putting a border around any of those things. So if we want to put borders around our divs, our spans, our h1s, our paragraph tags, you're going to see that our h1s are block tags, our paragraphs are blocks, our divs are blocks, and then finally we get to spans, which are inline elements. All of our heading tags, so whether it's in H1, H2, H3, if I can type here, are block elements. This goes all the way to 6, so there's H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, and H6. I just want to demo this with 3 of the H tags. They're different headings, and the difference between the headings is there'll be different sized headings. So the H1 being the largest, all the way down to H6 being the smallest. They're big and bold, but all of my H tags, whether it's H1 through H6, are block elements. Okay, so we've hit on most of the block elements. There's obviously more. We'll talk about them. So there's sections, there's articles. Those are also block elements. But I want to get into some inline elements. Where we're going to deal with inline elements for the most part is we'll deal with them with forms. So for instance, I might have an HTML form. And in that form, I might want the user to fill out their first and last name. So their first name, I would have a label for their first name, and I'd prompt them to enter their first name. And then I would have a text box next to it where the user can actually type some information about their first name, like, hey, my first name is Brian. So I'm going to have this input tag. It's a type equal to text, name equal to first name, and that's where we would enter our first name. And you'll notice that that input tag is going to be a self-closing tag. So I'm not going to have any text inside of that label. I'm just going to have the beginning and ending tag all as one, so it's self-closing. Okay, so now we look at our form, and this is starting to look a little bit messy because of the spacing and stuff like that, but you'll notice we have the first name, that's our label, that's what shows the first name text, and then directly adjacent to it, we have this field where we can enter our first name, this input type equal to text. Okay, so you're noticing our label and our text box go right next to each other. It doesn't take up all of the available space within our HTML body. We have inline elements. So I don't want to get into a ton of our form tags, but form tags are typically inline elements. So you've all seen forms where we have, enter your first name, last name, email, username, password, whatever. All of those different types of form fields, and you'll see those on new lines. So a lot of times you'll have a mixture of block and inline elements. So for instance, let's say I wanted to have that kind of setup where I'm going to have the user enter their first name and their last name. So I might decide I want to encapsulate the first and last name in a block element. So let's take the first name and put that in a div tag. And I'm going to indent this for ease of use. So I put that in a block, and then I'd repeat that block for the last name. So now I'm asking the user to enter their last name, and I got to make a few changes here so that I have 2 different fields. And now if I go out to my browser, you'll notice that I have the first name and the last name. And now we're starting to get annoyed because of these borders. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take off the borders. So I'm just commenting out the fact that there should be a border. And now you'll notice that the borders are all gone and we have our block element. So inline, enclosed inside of a block, inline, enclosed inside of a block. so we can mix and match inline elements and block elements. Okay, the other thing we want to be able, the other example of an inline element that we want to be able to deal with that comes up quite a bit besides form tags are image tags. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and add an image. I'm going to go to the MATC image. So I'm going to do a Google image search for Madison College. Okay, and then I'm going to go to the images, and I'm just going to grab this image. So I save the image, and I want that in my website in the images directory, MATC logo. It's a JPEG file. I skip back over to Atom, and I can see that image. So there's the MATC logo. So I want an image. And again, I'm using the code completion here with Atom. So I want a reference to this MATC logo. And we have to remember that my starting point is index.html. And I want to give it a relative path to this logo. So what I have to do is, relative to this HTML file, I'm in the web pages directory. I need to move up a directory so that I'm at the sample website. And then I need to move into the images folder and look for this particular file. So I need to move up, then I need to move into images, and then I'm looking for a specific file, matclogo.jpg. Our alternative text, so the alt tag is automatically put in here, and that goes back to our course coding standards. We're always going to have alternative text for people that might not be able to see those images. So our alternative text is going to be Madison College logo. And then I use the code completion tool. So I use the IntelliSense. So when I create an image, I use that code completion. It created an image tag, but it didn't create it as a self-closing tag, so it didn't put that / before the greater than. So I went ahead and added that after the fact, so that I'm adhering to our course coding standards. Okay, so I have this image, and then I want to put text next to it. So I want to use a span tag, Madison College. Okay, so I put text next to it, and I want to see how that renders out. And you'll notice, and I don't want you necessarily to worry about how this necessarily looks with this white space vertically, but you'll notice that I have this classic inline element, So I have inline elements, which are the span tags. I have the image, and then I have Madison College, which is also a span tag. And you'll notice that it doesn't go to the next line. And again, that's another indication that this is an inline element. This image is an inline element. It's not a block element. And I know that because the image doesn't force that word wrap. It doesn't take up all of the space left to right within the HTML body. It just takes up the space that it needs to render the image, height and width, but it doesn't actually take up all of the space. So I know that it's an inline element. Okay? So inline versus block elements is going to be really important throughout this semester. And if you're confused now, don't worry about it too much. You'll get the hang of it. Really, this is about creating our first sample site. With this being our first sample site, I kind of cheated and I put these borders in. So, and eventually we got annoyed, so we commented them out. But let's assume that I wanted to leave them in. Okay, so the borders are back. One problem with this is that we have our style rules defined inside of our HTML, and that's generally a bad idea. What this is known as is inline styles. So HTML supports the fact that I might want to style an HTML page using inline styles. I have my head section, I have style tags, and I'm defining some style, I'm putting borders around things, but I really probably shouldn't have it here. Even though it's supported by the browser, it's supported by HTML, really this belongs in a separate file. It's style information. It's style sheet information. So I really don't want it here. Okay, instead I want this to be in a separate style sheet. Okay, so I want the same information, but I want it in a separate style sheet. The way I'm going to do that is I'm going to create a style sheet. So I'm going to create a new file called master.css. And I'm going to take all of the style rules that I had defined. So this was the style rule that I had defined. I'm going to cut it out of the HTML and move it into the style sheet. Okay, I'll save the HTML, save the style sheet, and you'll notice that the borders are gone. However, if this HTML page is linked up to this style sheet, then those borders will come back. So what I want to do is I want to get rid of these style tags that were inside my HTML, and I want to leave all the style rules to this style sheet. My style rules being really simple. I'm just creating a border around all of the divs, all of the spans, all of the H1s, and all of the paragraph tags. So I want that rule, I want that styling to actually happen to my web page. The only way that's going to happen is if I reference that style sheet. So this HTML page has to reference this style sheet. Okay, so now, again, I have to deal with a relative path. So relative to this HTML file, I need to move up to my website, into my style sheets folder, and then I'm going to look for a specific file. Okay, so the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to have a link, which tells me the type of link that I have as a style sheet, and then the location of that style sheet is going to be defined in this href attribute. So I'm going up to my website, then I'm going into the style sheets folder, and then I'm looking for master.css. Okay, so now these two files are linked. My HTML file is linked to my style sheet, and you'll notice that the borders are back. So my style rules didn't change. It's just where those styles actually got created and defined is no longer inside my HTML file. It's defined inside of the style sheet. So if instead I don't want solid borders, I want dashed borders. Now you'll notice that I have dashed borders for all of those elements. Okay, so really the takeaways for this screencast are how we set up our page and take advantage of some of the tools that are available to us. So we're using Atom. As long as we let Atom know that this is an HTML file, we get that IntelliSense and code completion. So we take advantage of some of those tools. The second takeaway is, what's the difference between a block element and an inline element? So a block element is going to take up all of the available space, all the spaces that is available to it. So think of it like if you move into a house and you have kids, and a kid has their own room, a kid's going to take up that whole room. That's all of their space. That's a block element. Versus if you move away to college and you're in a dorm and you're sharing an apartment with 6 other people, like, you need to just take up the space that you need. You can't take up all the available space. You just need to take up the space that's needed. And that'd be more like an inline element. Okay, so examples, our H1 tags are going to be blocks, H2, H3, paragraphs, divs. Those are going to be your block elements. Your inline elements are going to be spans, images, lots of different form tags. Okay, so as the semester goes along, we'll get more and more comfortable with what's the difference between inline elements, what's the difference between block elements, what are block elements, what are inline elements. Okay, so that's the second main takeaway. And then lastly, the third main takeaway is just how we're going to organize a page. So a page has lots of different elements that make it up. It has our HTML, which is what this class is, but then it also has assets like images, style sheets, things like that. And we really have to be comfortable with how those things link together and how those things kind of weave together and where their role is and how they fit together. So in this case, we have relative paths for our images, we have relative paths for our style sheets, and those are all linked together relative to our HTML file. Okay, so those are the main takeaways from today's screencast.